And so now we are turning to the second panel of the day, focused on China's growing role in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. So again, I'm Henry Hale, George Washington University, co-director with Marlene Laruelle of PONAR's Eurasia and professor at George Washington University. And just on behalf of PONAR's, I want to thank again Jeff and CSIS for organizing and making this event possible, and so I look forward to the rest of the discussion of the day. So I think we'll just dive right in. So we'll just go in the order in which people are listed in the program. So we'll start with Eric McGlinchey of George Mason University, then turn to Sébastien Pérouse of GW, and then Anar Valiyev of ADA University in Baku. So Eric, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Henry. I don't know if you guys have the agenda. You'll notice that the title of my presentation is different from the title of the paper, and I've actually took the liberty of changing the title of my memo as well. And that's because my own thinking on this topic has evolved as I've been confronted with empirics. Empirics are a pain, right? And they change the way you do your analysis. I was struck by a comment that Elizabeth made about one of her colleagues in China discussing the fact that there's this Russian information campaign against against China in Central Asia, and the net result. Now Elizabeth didn't say this, but my perception, at least going into this project, that indeed there was some of this, and that this campaign was successful or is successful. So I began this work with the assumption that there is xenophobia in Central Asia. And it's not that I've entirely abandoned the fact or the proposition that there is xenophobia. There is some xenophobia. It's just nowhere near as widespread as I thought it was. So that's I think the punchline that I want to leave you with, and I'll walk you through how I've arrived at this conclusion. But I've been struck by how receptive, actually, Central Asians are towards China. Let me just give you an outline of where I'll be going. First, I'd like to contextualize the approval of China in Central Asia, contrast this to the approval of Russia. I think part of the reason why I began with this position of xenophobia is in contrast to Central Asian approval of Russia. Actually, it is significantly lower. So Russia still remains the top dog as far as how people perceive these foreign powers. But also, I think what's important to keep in mind, and here I'll be drawing from Gallup World Poll data, is that the modal response that Central Asians have when asked whether or not they approve of the Chinese leadership is actually yes. That is the single greatest response. That is one of approval of the leadership. This doesn't mean that Central Asians don't approve of China. It's just that it's a much more complicated picture than I think a lot of people have portrayed. One of the, I think, things that's overlooked is that many Central Asians simply may not have enough information, or may be conflicted and may not feel comfortable expressing an opinion one way or the other. So actually the do not knows and the refused answers are actually quite high in this data. Part of the reason why I think that might be, and I'll talk about this in the second point here, is that China plays a very important role in Central Asia economically, but that economic role has both been positive and in some aspects negative. So I'll talk about some of that positive, some of the benefits that China has brought, but also some of the controversy that has surrounded several of the investment projects in Central Asia. The controversy around these economic projects, I would also posit, has also led to a rise of popular anti-Chinese narratives. And these are the things that initially caught my eye, and this is why I initially thought that the role or the view of China in Central Asia was very negative, these narratives. There are several of these. I'll go through them. And I'll conclude with this idea that perhaps these narratives resonate among some populations more than others. One of the things that I found digging into the data here is that there's some variation in who perceives China and how, and it's actually the younger population that is perceiving China more positively than the older population. Okay, so let me begin with a contextualization there's a trick here for turning off this jumping mouse. Okay, yeah, so hopefully that mouse won't jump around anymore. Okay, so my initial entry into how Central Asians perceive China is the media, I think like most other people. And if you read the Central Asian media, you see a lot of stuff about these kinds of events. So, up here at the top left of the screen, these are protesters in Nur-Sultan. For those of you who haven't been following developments in Kazakhstan, Nur-Sultan is Astana, the new capital there. They're protesting in sympathy with the protests in Zhanazen. They're protesting against the nature of Chinese investment in Kazakhstan. In particular, they're upset by the fact that a lot of the people who are being employed in the oil industry in Kazakhstan are Chinese nationals and not Kazakh nationals. So this has been going on in the past week, actually right in the run-up to the bilateral between China and Kazakhstan. On the right, you see protesters outside of the UNDP building in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, and they're protesting against the quote-unquote re-education camps in northwest China, and they're protesting in particular about the fact that within these re-education camps there are Kyrgyz who live in northwest China. This is the kind of stuff that you see fairly frequently in the media. This is the kind of stuff that you see frequently when you're walking down the streets in Central Asia, these kinds of anti-Chinese protests. This is the kind of stuff that initially led me to believe that Sinophobia was actually pretty pronounced in Central Asia. Let me give you a little bit more contextualization here. I understand that there's three trend lines here. There's a lot to digest. This is just a condensation of Central Asian perceptions towards for lack of a better term, the great powers in the United States, Russia, and China. And this is an aggregation of 4 countries. This is Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. I'll break this down by country in the next slide. And the question that is being asked here is, do you approve, and I should underscore that, do you approve of the Chinese leadership, the Russian leadership, or the US leadership? So again, these are only the approved responses. And if you take a look at 2017, the fact that 40% approve of China does not mean that 60% disapprove. There's lots of do not knows and refused. So let me bring those up. In all 4 countries, I think it's important to note that the disapproval level of China is lower than the approval level. So more, again, the modal response here is one of approve. More people in all 4 of the countries that are polled, and this is 2006 to 2018 aggregated, approve of China than disapprove. I think what's also interesting about this data is that the do not know responses and the refuse responses are in most cases significantly greater than the do not approve response. There's a lot of people in Central Asia who just don't feel comfortable opining one way or the other about how they feel towards the Chinese leadership. And I think part of the reason this may be the case is the complex economic picture of China in Central Asia. So China is, as we've already heard from the previous panel, China is the largest foreign direct investor in Central Asia. Some other points worth emphasizing, China is the largest export destination for 2 of the 5 Central Asian countries. So it consumes 13% of Kazakh exports, and it consumes nearly all, 83% of Turkmen exports. This is largely hydrocarbons. So it's not just foreign direct investment, but it's also critical economic trade that's going on here. China is the leading source of imports for Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. This is a major change from when I first started studying Central Asia a couple decades ago, where Chinese goods were much less widespread. But today, 40% of Tajik imports and 40% of Kyrgyz imports come from China, and about 25% of Uzbek imports are coming from China. So trade, it's not just foreign direct investment, it's trade that's critically important. And then you can see from these pictures here, China is heavily involved in infrastructure redevelopment, infrastructure development and redevelopment in Central Asia. The picture to the top left, this is the Shakustan Tunnel in Tajikistan. And I don't know if, I know some of you may have traveled through, there used to be, well, for a long time, there was the Iranian tunnel in Tajikistan, which was a bit of a death trap if you travel through it. The Chinese tunnel is very well built. And the Iranian tunnel's gotten better as well, actually. But this has really reduced the travel time between Dushanbe and Hojand. So here's an example of China having a very positive influence on the daily lives of Central Asians. And we see these kinds of infrastructure developments all over Central Asia. So if you're going from Bishkek to Karakol, for example, the road from Bishkek to Karakol used to be a little harrowing. If you take it now, it's much better, and that's because of the fact that the Chinese have rebuilt that road. So the infrastructure has had very real and positive impacts on everyday Central Asian life, and I think a lot of Central Asians are happy about this. At the same time, there's been controversy. This is the Bishkek power plant in Kyrgyzstan. The Bishkek power plant was retrofitted in 2017, 2018 by TBEA, which is a very large Chinese corporation, also involved, by the way, in retrofitting the Tajik power plant in Dushanbe, and it broke down in January of 2018 in one of the largest, the most severe cold snaps that Kyrgyzstan has seen. So people weren't happy about that for obvious reasons. But there's also allegations of a lot of self-dealing that was going on with the contract with TVA for this plant. So it was a $386 million contract, and now there are 6 former Kyrgyz ministers, 2 of them prime ministers, who are under investigation for embezzling $111 million from this contract. So there's a sense among Central Asians that Chinese investment sometimes improves things, but also comes with potential downsides. And people perceive in Central Asia that there's some self-dealing going on here, and that the Chinese aren't entirely in the dark about this, that they're aware of this. At least the company officials are aware of this. So there's a perception that, not all is well here. And so there's this mixed picture, and I think this mixed picture leads to some of these anti-Chinese narratives that I'd just like to briefly touch upon. So first, there's this narrative about economic dependency, and Stephen, I don't know if he's still here. I know he made the argument that China doesn't want to be perceived as forcing these countries into dependent relationships, and I agree with you 100%. At the same time, I think if you look from the ground level up, a lot of people perceive this. A lot of people in Central Asia perceive this. And I'll just give you one data point about this. Tajikistan wasn't able to repay the loan for the retrofitting of the power plant in Dushanbe. In order to compensate China for this loan, they turned over control of a gold mine to China. This, I think, has negative impacts on China's soft power in the region. So although there may not be this intent of dependency or debt dependency, I think nevertheless there does arrive a narrative within the region that there is debt dependency. There's also this perception that these projects are replete with corruption. So I already described one instance of this with the Tajik power plant and the embezzlement of money. There's many more that one could cite. Another anti-Chinese narrative that you see, and you saw that actually in the first picture that I put up there, this ethno-national threat narrative, the idea that China poses a threat to Central Asian nationalities, either in the re-education camps that we see in Northwest China, but also, interestingly, there's this narrative, somewhat widespread, that Chinese men are stealing Central Asian women. So this idea that there's not enough brides in China, so they're going to Central Asia, and they're looking for brides there. Now, there are, of course, behind all these narratives, some empirical support for it. I'll just give you a little bit of it that we may find amusing, but I think the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz take very seriously. So in Kazakhstan in 2017, a group of Chinese bachelors enlisted the support of an ad agency in Astana to put an ad up on Facebook to try to find these brides, and they were going to have kind of a bachelorette competition, right? And women were going to audition for the potential to be a bride to a wealthy Chinese man. This led to lots of protests in Kazakhstan. We saw here's just another example from Kyrgyzstan. There's a well-known pundit, Melis Merathaliyev, who claimed in a February 2018 lecture that 30,000 Chinese men had taken Kyrgyz brides. Now, this is obviously a figure that is exaggerated. I don't think there's anywhere close to that. But this kind of stuff gets traction, and you see it again and again in the media, and that may be driving some of this anti-Chinese sentiment that we see. I'll wrap up quickly, I promise. A couple other things here. The last one I'll talk about is this idea that Chinese, the people who are being employed in Chinese factories and Chinese industry in Central Asia are disproportionately ethnically Chinese. And again, there's some empirical support for that, and this has led to, I think, some of the anti-Chinese narratives. So there is grounds for these, but the question is how widespread is this? Well, I mean, if you look at trend lines, it is true that the proportion of Central Asians who disapprove of Beijing has increased over the past 12 years. So it's gone up from about 22% to 24%. Beijing's approval rating has also declined. It's gone from 44 to 39%. So there has been some erosion in Central Asian sentiment towards the Chinese leadership. At the same time, I think there's some good news, and this is where I'd like to wrap up. If you look at Central Asian youth, and here I'm defining Central Asian youth as those who are 30 or younger, they are much more upbeat on Beijing than older Central Asians. So if you look at the aggregate data in 2018, 43% of Central Asian youth under the age of 30 are positive, approve of China, whereas only 37% over the age of 31. So there's, I think, ground for hope, and I'll wrap up here by putting one potential causal mechanism for why I think there is this greater attraction to China among the youth than among older populations. And I think, frankly, Chinese soft power efforts are working with this one part of the Central Asian population. We know about the Confucius Institutes. One thing that we know a little bit less well about is the number of scholarships that are being given to Central Asian students to study in China. These are pretty significant. I'll just give you one example. In 2018, there were almost 12,000 Kazakhs studying in China, many of them on scholarships. The population of Kazakhstan is not all that high, what, 25 million, something like that. What's that?
Kazakhstan?
Kazakhstan, yeah.
18.
18 million, okay. So this is a relatively large figure. Kazakhs were the Kazakh students were the 10th largest group of foreign students studying in China, right? So I mean, put that in perspective, a population of 18 million, and yet as far as all foreign students studying in China, Kazakhs are number 10. This is pretty significant. I think China is making a major investment in soft power, particularly at the education level, and this is having real effects among Central Asian youth. And I think looking forward, we could imagine a trend line. Jonathan was talking about trend lines. We could imagine a trend line where this continues and China's image in Central Asia continues to improve. So I'm questioning xenophobia and just the opposite. I think there's a growing attraction to China in Central Asia that I think a lot of us have missed.
Okay, great, thank you. Now we'll turn to Sébastien Pérouse of George Washington University.
Thank you very much, Henry. So I will be presenting on China's soft power in Central Asia. So in a way, my presentation will follow up with Eric Swan's. And I agree with Eric. I mean, how China is viewed from Central Asia is a kind of complex phenomenon with plenty of diverse approaches and mixed feelings. But, well, in any case, I mean, debates on Sinophobia is in Central Asia, debates on the Chinese presence in Central Asia is a point of concern for Beijing. Why? Because among reasons, I mean, Sinophobia could threaten Chinese investments and economic and political ambitions in the region. So to mitigate existing or potential tensions with local governments and populations actually in Central Asia and beyond, as you know well, and as Eric was explaining, Beijing has embarked on a policy of soft power. So in other words, China has set for itself the goal of winning the hearts and minds of people beyond its borders, as formulated by Joseph Nye. So to do so, China has used very diverse tools, and I don't have time to elaborate on that, but China has promoted in Central Asia and beyond, of course, its culture, the development of Mandarin, I mean, trying to teach Chinese as much as possible. It has also, Beijing has promoted its model of political stability and sustainability, which would be presented as something different and independent from Western countries. And it has presented itself, China has presented itself as an economic model of development and as a country which is contributing to the development of other countries. But, I mean, again, I agree with Eric, but really what he's trying to see is increasing debates among Central Asia political, academic, and expertise circles concerning Chinese presence and policies. And some real present xenophobic narrative in local media in Central Asia, which suggests that, okay, I mean, Chinese soft power might work, but still, I mean, my feeling is that still Beijing is kind of struggling to turn its charm offensive into a really effective use of soft power. And what I mean here, what is important is that this, so far, I think still limited impact of Chinese soft power is not to say that China's soft power policy is doomed to fail in Central Asia or globally, but its success will probably depend on the capacity of Chinese authority to respond to some imponderables and their ability to learn from, on Beijing's ability to learn from its experience and revise its strategy accordingly. So let me mention here several points in the few minutes I have. First, on the economic level. Well, the effectiveness of China's strategy to present itself as an economic model will rely actually on its ability to make its economic system sustainable and to successfully promote it as a success story. Which means that the continuation of the economic slowdown that China has been experiencing since the second half of the 2000s could, in a way, demonstrate the stark contrast between the Chinese official narratives of success story on the one hand and a much bleaker reality on the ground, and which would certainly damage the perception of Beijing's model of development. And this is a point, actually, which is regularly addressed in articles I read on published in Central Asia on the Chinese presence in the region. On the other hand, China ostentatious display of its economic power on the international stage since the 2000s has, I would say, increasingly contrasted with the narrative it has used since the 1990s. And China was portraying itself as a developing country supporting poor or less developed countries. And China and the Belt Road Initiative are more and more viewed as an economic power whose weight and influence is increasingly unbalanced, and which would even serve essentially Chinese interests, and which could deepen the gap between Chinese power and countries in transition. A second point, on the economic level, and Eric mentioned that, I mean, so the repressive nature of the Chinese political system, which has been even more openly wielded by Xi Jinping than by his predecessor Hu Jintao, I think might really hamper the effectiveness of China's soft power through, I mean, the apprehensive reactions it generates in Central Asia, and again, beyond Central Asia. And as Eric was mentioning, I mean, since 2017, the disclosure of re-education camps in Xinjiang, as well as a ban which has been imposed by the Chinese administration, preventing several hundred ethnic Kazakhs and Kyrgyz from leaving the country, I think have a real impact on how on the image of China in the region. A third point is on the implementation of soft power policy. What is interesting is that China's soft power policy has been designed and implemented almost exclusively by Chinese political authorities and state structures. But as demonstrated by Joseph Nye, an effective use of soft power is less about the ability of political authorities to charm foreign societies than that of civil society in a given country. Which means that with this approach, China has, in a way, confused governmental public diplomacy with soft power, in which civil society generally has an important role to play. Of course, I mean, for sure, I mean, public diplomacy can contribute to the promotion of soft power. That's true. But its impact is likely to be weakened if it is not augmented by private and independent actors. And as candidly recognized by a former Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Fu Ying, the Chinese government has used very regularly the terms of soft power, public diplomacy, and external publicity interchangeably. So, I mean, the impact of Chinese government propaganda is likely to remain limited also as long as it will not be supported by autonomous civil society actors, and here I mean by Chinese actors, but also by Central Asian actors who would be really critical in effectively propagating an image of China that is not or not anymore associated with political authorities. That said, of course, I mean, China's difficulties in winning hearts and minds of people abroad is not specific to Central Asia. And for example, David Chambos, in his book China Goes Global, has a whole chapter on that and demonstrates very well the weak impact of China's soft power globally, including in the African or the South American continents, where Beijing really spared no efforts in investing and promoting its model of development. But in Central Asia, I mean, local people willing and able to promote a positive image of China will be all the more important that China's geographical contiguity, demographic weight, and military power strengthen local phobias, and especially in bordering countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And Eric was mentioning, for example, it's kind of cliche, where in Kyrgyzstan, people are afraid seeing so many Kyrgyz women getting married to Chinese men. And another point is that while the growth of xenophobic sentiment has so far been kept under control by the local governments, by the local authoritarian governments, some regime or policy changes in the future could open up the question of Chinese obvious presence. As, for example, it happened in Southeast Asia. We have a striking example for that is that in Indonesia, for example, Suharto authoritarianism had for 3 decades prevented anti-Chinese expression. But after 1998, as Suharto loosened his grip on power, a violent demonstration quickly started against the Chinese minority living in the country and against China's policy in the country. So to wrap up, for many, Central Asian analysts and citizens, Beijing's soft power policy in Central Asia remains, at least for now, often viewed as, how to say, a kind of temporary tool, conceding a hard power policy designed to impose more political and economic influence for mostly the benefit of China, and potentially sometimes, that's what we read, undermining local development. But, and here, again, I will follow on what Eric was saying. Despite this so far limited impact of Chinese soft power in the region, this does not mean that China is systematically unpopular, and I totally agree with Eric on that, far from it. Eric, for example, was talking about Central Asian youth, and yes, of course, China can be very popular among young people. Why? Because China brings plenty of opportunities to launch a business. China brings plenty of opportunity to trade and to make a living. But here, I'd like maybe to add a small nuance, which I think is important. Considering China as an opportunity to make money and have an easier life does not necessarily mean that the very same people admire China. Actually, plenty of young and less young people thank China, but this does not necessarily mean that China is winning their hearts and minds. And Eric mentioned very rightly that China was getting more popular thanks to its education assistance to the region. And this is definitely true. Although here again, there might be some nuances. Yes, China is thanked for, is welcome for its education assistance, but this does not mean that China is admired by students. And a very quick example here, I have interviewed, I travel regularly to China, to universities where there are Central Asian students. Many interviews with Central Asian students there, and it's trying to see how many of them are, of course, interested in studying there because they study in better conditions, they receive a better education than they would, for example, in Central Asia. But at the same time, they're not, extremely interested in Chinese culture and more generally in the country. And you have a Kazakh scholar, Gauhar Nurshah, who works a lot on China's soft power in Central Asia, and who was explaining exactly the same thing with all people, a lot of people attending the Confucius Institutes. They go to the Confucius Institute to learn Chinese, but many of them actually have a very limited interest in knowing more, for example, following lectures on Chinese culture or anything on China. So I will stop by saying that one important point maybe for Beijing will be to go beyond showing what is specific to China and convincingly demonstrate what is or what can be universal about its system and build more bridges with local people who will be ready and willing to support and promote Chinese models and concepts which have so far, often raised apprehension among Central Asian population. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll turn to Anar Valiyev of ADA University in Baku.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. I really appreciate it. From the Central Asia to the Caucasus, actually South Caucasus, so my short kind of the introduction would be to discuss more about Central Asian, more about Chinese interests in, say, in South Caucasus. What are the implications of that, and how the countries of the South Caucasus react on that penetration of China to the interests of the South Caucasus countries? Well, starting from right from beginning, I can say that technically China didn't have any political or economic reasons in South Caucasus. There's none. There used to be none. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, and initially first 20 years, I would say that China was kind of symbolically present in this region. And why was happening? Well, first of all, China was not politically interested in the region because the region was far away from China. Geographically, it was far away. Culturally, it was far away. And China didn't want to penetrate to the region because, in contrast to other countries such as United States or European Union, kind of as a union, China didn't have too much political interest in the countries. For example, United States was interested in mostly kind of economic reasons or some kind of political democratization of the country, versus EU was interested more in transportation links and further expanding its values. So Chinese political interests were not kind of present in this region. From economic perspective, the region also didn't represent any kind of I would say, interest, because technically, compared with the Central Asia or any part of the world, South Caucasus is a very small area. So population of the whole South Caucasus will be considered, let's say, around 15 or 16 million population overall, with Azerbaijan around 9-10 million, Georgia 3.5 million, Armenia 2.5 million. So it's 5 times less than average province of China. So why would China would come and just from export potential or from demographic perspective? So economically also the South Caucasus was not so interesting. But a lot of things changed starting from the 2014, 2015, and there's several reasons affected Chinese rise in the South Caucasus. Well, the first reason is disengagement of United States and EU from not EU much, but mostly United States from the South Caucasus affairs, both politically and economically. Second issue was the problems with EU, internal problems, such things as a Brexit and all other migration crisis, and the kind of the disengagement of EU from a little bit more giving less attention to the South Caucasus. And all of this led to the situation when Russia became a little bit more active in the region. So the countries of the region saw Chinese interest as something could be counterbalancing the Russian interest in the South Caucasus. And the Chinese kind of the policy in the South Caucasus could be best described, starting from the 1990s, as a famous Lincoln's terms, such as, "I walk slowly, but I never walked backward." So they were always consistently coming to this, slowly engaging in the region, building up their presence over here in the region. Speaking about the interest of the China right now, I would say that the biggest chunk of the attention goes to Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan represents kind of one of the biggest countries in the region, and around 70% of the export-import operations with the region and investments falls on Azerbaijan. So why Azerbaijan is a little bit, I would say, have more interest from China's side for the last couple of years? There's a few reasons for that. First reason is kind of the economic, slowly growing economic interest in the region. ABOR initiatives has one of the important aspects of the linkage between East and West, and Azerbaijan and Georgia represent this one important link between China and European Union. Of course, if we look at ABOR, kind of the map on the transportation links, or so-called Silk Road links between China and Europe, Azerbaijani-Georgian route is not there. It's just considered as a kind of a supplemental route. But recently, back in 2015, there was a kind of the trial transportation that was taken from the China to Europe for around 4,000 kilometers from China, and it reached Europe in a record 6 days. So for the 6 days, the wagon, or just a train that leaving the Chinese border from Kazakhstan and reaching to the European Union, took around less than 6 days or less than 6 days. It showed not only Chinese, but the signal to the world that that's kind of the link or transportation could be one of the most safest and one of the most stable transportation routes for China and European Union. In addition, China tries to just also supplement obor that is happening, that's passing through Iran, in a case that if there's a certain type of the turmoil in Iran or some kind of the war or conflict starts, so what's going to happen with this obor link that happens through, that goes through Iran? So in this case, Azerbaijani-Georgian link can substitute Iranian link in the case of the turmoils over there. But beyond of that, what is really interesting for the region, that why the region is also interested in Chinese this initiative, why they couldn't just go beyond of that and just cooperate more with European Union or United States. Well, there's a few reasons. 2014, 2015, and 16 were very critical years for the countries of the South Caucasus. They devaluated their currencies, the economic crisis, and the prices of oil went down, and especially for Azerbaijan, it was really a hard time. So the cash was drawn out. There was not enough funding for kind of supporting infrastructure projects. And at this moment, Azerbaijan, and partly Georgia, also needed necessarily the investment into the certain type of the projects, such as constructing the roads, building the infrastructure necessary for the building transportation roads. But from perspective of economic, I would say, vitality or kind of the feasibility, obor will never be able to give so much money that Azerbaijan would have get from the oil revenues. So for the last 10 or 12 years, Azerbaijan got billions of dollars from the oil revenues. This oil revenue is going down. And sooner or later, this oil revenues will completely diminish. So what is Azerbaijan hoping? Not to substitute this oil revenues from the transportation, because transportation will maximum bring around $400 million per year for Azerbaijan in the best case. That's not enough to substitute what Azerbaijan is losing from the oil prices going down or the less or decreased oil extraction in the country. But it hopes that Azerbaijan and also Georgia hopes that along the road, China will be able to build certain type of the hubs or certain type of the enterprises that will produce products in the countries of the South Caucasus, whether it's Azerbaijan or Georgia, and through that period, through that territory, they will start exporting Chinese certain type of the products that is produced in Azerbaijan or Georgia. For example, recently, in 2019, Azerbaijani president went to China and signed agreement for construction of, there's around $300 million dollars will be invested in construction of the tire factory in Azerbaijan. So you can ask, why in the world will just produce a tire factory in Azerbaijan? But the reason was China is trying to move also the productions of the certain type of the products from China to the regions, whether it's a Central Asia or whether it's a Caucasus, in order to cut on the transportation costs. So production of the tire in Azerbaijan on Chinese investments, and then you have only Georgia, Black Sea, and then it's already in Bulgaria, Romania, or in Istanbul, and those all export can just go even faster. So instead of just dragging the tire from somewhere from Shanghai or I don't know, from the mainland of China, it's better to construct the tire factory in Azerbaijan and ship it over there. So that was actually the basic idea behind the Chinese kind of coming to the region to bring this industry that is produced over there to the regions. And second one, again, earn certain type of the profits from this. And again, in addition to that, Chinese also interested in partly, not much politically, but also military supply. For example, they right now negotiating with Azerbaijan of supply certain type of the weapons such as tank type 99A2 or fighter aircraft Chengdu J-10 and selling to Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan is also looking for alternative supplies of the weapons, because so far they were buying most of the weapons from Russia, and meanwhile Russia supplied the same type of the weapon, a little bit superior to Armenia, so we're always buying the same weapon from the same supplier. And it doesn't give Azerbaijan competitive advantage in front of Armenia, so one of the choices is to move toward to the alternative supply things. And also, for example, Azerbaijan bought recently a year ago, from Belarus, the multiple launch rocket system called Polones that actually was produced with the help of the Chinese experts. That's about economic and political. And what's the future implication of that issues? I mean, comparing any Chinese platform, such as obor, with let's say, Russian or EU integration projects, it will be worth to mention that a Chinese platform does not threaten either US or EU integration projects. In fact, it will supplement what European Union tries to do for many years. I mean, if you remember, starting from the 1990s until the mid of 2000s, there was a great project called Traseka that was kind of the platform of transportation platform that was helping Central Asia countries to export its potential goods, and Azerbaijan also, and Georgia, to Europe, and from Europe to Central Asia. That was kind of the predecessor of OBOR. But Traseka benefited mostly the oil exporting countries such as Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, partly Georgia, because there was nothing else to export from the region to Europe except oil. And 70 or 80% of the export potential of these countries was following the oil, versus European investment was mostly machinery and technology. So it will supplement this and revive maybe a Traseka project, helping Europe to get closer to the region. The next Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, kind of helping a lot to the region, especially Azerbaijan got a loan on $600 million for constructing TANAP, Trans-Anatolian pipeline, that will offer the gas or will supply gas from the Azerbaijan to Turkey and further to Europe. But there's a little bit, I would say, some kind of the concern of the countries, and especially Azerbaijan, that whether the China would use debt trap diplomacy that it used before in Africa or other countries, would it at some point, by giving too much credits or investment, would it by some point would love to get some lucrative industries, whether it's oil refineries or a certain type of thing. So this is only kind of the concerns Azerbaijan has. But again, we discussed about the anti-Chinese sentiments or something like that. There's no kind of visible, I would say, anti-Chinese sentiments on the type of investments or businesses, or so far any kind of the Chinese political kind of the penetration to the region. And I would say that for the next, would say 5 or 6 years, there will be a kind of more Chinese influence, soft power, and economic kind of investment to the region more than anything else, with continued, again, as I will repeat myself, with continued disengagement of the United States and continued problems with European Union. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're very fortunate that Maria Amelicheva of National Defense University has agreed to provide comments and add sort of her own insights to this discussion. So we'll turn things over to you, please.
Thank you. And I would like to begin by extending my thank you to all those of you who've decided to stick around for this second panel. I think it provides a very, very nice complement to the earlier panel, in that it picks on some of the themes that were raised in the earlier panel concerning China's material influence and soft influence in Central Asia and in the Caucasus. I also think that there is another similarity in that the conclusions that these authors of the policy memos and research arrive at are applicable far beyond Central Asia or Eurasia, and they speak to many contemporary policy debates as well. And Eric's research and policy memo is a great example of the latter. In the West, the so-called great power competition framework have sort of blinded many analysts to the fact that people around the world do not share our fears of their country's dependency on China, that trap discussed in the earlier panel, and that people don't perceive China's presence in their homeland as a threat. And I think it's a very big takeaway from Eric's research. On the other hand, Eric, just like many other researchers interested in public attitudes and public perceptions of the others, rely on survey data. And the question that I've always had is whether it is possible to make broad inferences from rather narrowly formulated survey questions. And to be more specific, Sino or Sinophobia is a rather broad phenomenon. It refers to sentiments against China, or against Chinese people, or against overseas Chinese, or against Chinese culture, or all of the above. And this anti-Chinese sentiment may arise in response to a great variety of factors, such as the presence of significant Chinese minority, or the history of majority-minority relations, or disparity in wealth, and so on and so forth. So as far as I understand, the policy memo and research that Eric conducts is based on the survey that uses a question which reads like this. It asks the respondents to approve or disapprove the job performance of the leadership of China. And I wonder, wouldn't it be a kind of ecological fallacy to make inferences about all other Chinese things on the basis of this narrowly formulated question? To be more specific, do you think that the results would have been different had the question been formulated differently and used Chinese people or Chinese culture instead of Chinese leadership? And in this regard, I really like the approach that has been used by the team of survey researchers at the World Values Survey. They kind of use a more indirect approach by asking respondents to approve or disapprove of a Chinese neighbor moving next door, or approve or disapprove of a daughter being married to a Chinese husband. So those are the kind of more indirect ways of tapping in the individual's attitudes, including attitudes towards a neighbor, in this case, China. And I really like your discussion of the age-based differences in Central Asians' attitudes towards China. I would really like to see sort of the quantification of those differences, if you could provide some charts or tables that will show us that the age-based differential in sympathy or antipathy towards China based on individuals' age, that would be great. But more importantly, if you could link it back to your initial argument that Central Asians are Sino-agnostic, and with more interaction and greater involvement of the Central Asian youth, in particular in China-funded education opportunities and other projects, they are more likely to change agnosticism for approval and sympathy. That would be great as well. So moving on to Sebastian Perou's paper, which nicely complements the study and policy memo by Eric. So Sebastian picks up the theme of anti-Chinese sentiment in Central Asia and asks, why hasn't China been more successful in building a more favorable image in Central Asia? And the answer is that China has confused governmental public diplomacy with real soft power measures, which must include a real role for the civil society actors. And I think that these conclusions are very compelling. However, I would use the metaphor of this bottle. Is it half full or half empty? And I think this is the problem that we have with our interpretation of the available data on China in Central Asia or elsewhere. So we can interpret it as if China is not really accomplishing its soft power influence objectives, or it has been rather successful. So I proffer an argument that an alternative interpretation of the data can be made, that China is actually doing remarkably well given the challenges that it faces, because China is not trying to build this favorable image on an empty space. It is actually up against deeply ingrained cultural traditions, norms, and institutions, either communist or liberal international order or whatnot. So it's not really doing it in the empty space. And this is not an easy feat to change other people's attitudes. I would say the United States has tried it over and over again, and it has not succeeded in many contexts, despite all of the resources, human and monetary, that it has invested up to date. So again, this is not to undermine conclusions that you make, but others argue for putting them in the proper context of the structure of ideas, constraints, and challenges that China is facing in trying to spread its influence. And the second point is, so I think in your paper you kind of make this implicit conjecture that for soft power, the power of attraction to work, there has to be a role for civil society actors. So civil society is a necessary condition for one country or people to like other country or people. And I'm not sure if I agree with that, and I'm not sure if I'm right. So I'm kind of offering this as a question for everyone to think. Can affinity between societies and states develop through other avenues? So having a shared enemy, can having a shared enemy be enough for two countries or societies to like each other? So I'm just, again, do we need to have that civil society to civil society interactions for soft power, to work as successfully as I would argue it would, or can there be other avenues for developing affinity among societies and states? And moving on to the last policy memo in research, it seems like it presents sort of like this model bilateral Azerbaijan-China relationship where Azerbaijani public and a political establishment have hold China in a very positive light. They don't think that China has a political agenda because of the geographical distance that separate these two countries. But I wonder so I'll offer you a counter-argument. African continent, it's really far away, and the amount of investments and the amount of involvement varies from country to country. So does the public sentiment towards China. So I wonder if in the foreseeable future we can see some changes in the public sentiment as the relationship evolves, as China's presence becomes more prominent and visible in Azerbaijan. Wouldn't it suffice for the countries to be so would distance continue to sort of play the role of a buffer in a way? And then I also want to kind of challenge you on your conclusion that China's efforts in Azerbaijan are complementary to the EU integration projects, and they are challenging a Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union project. Why it is so? We heard that Chinese projects do not involve conditionality. So in the context of Azerbaijan and other post-Soviet states, it means that they will prod the institutions and norms and practices that the EU has worked so hard to reform and replace. So in that light, wouldn't then Chinese projects be kind of at odds with the EU initiatives and efforts in Azerbaijan? So I'll stop here and open it to discussion.
Okay, thank you for the great comments and questions. So maybe let's just open it up, maybe take one round of questions, and then we'll come back to the authors, speakers, and you can respond to Maria's comments as well. Yes, please, in the back.
Dan Roper with the Association of the United States Army. I'd be interested in the reactions of the countries in the region that you just discussed to the Chinese release of the National Defense White Paper in July that sort of justified their expansion both militarily and how it was supporting initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, in the back.
I have two questions. The first is how I think the first presenters both describe how China is viewed in Central Asia. But from the Chinese perspective, the way I read Chinese public opinion polls is it seems to be two-way traffic. Central Asian countries' cultural, lots of those soft power also increasingly getting into China. For example, the most popular foreign singer in China, not the Russian fabulous Khodovsky, who passed away, but is a Kazakh young man, Dimati. And he's so popular in China. He won so many prizes, taking over China like a hurricane. He's still the most popular. And Central Asian sports, other things. So culture seems to be the soft power going two ways. I'd like to, both of you have to comment on that. This is my own observation. Secondly, I'd like to ask a question for Professor Valiev. From South Caucasus perspective, how do you see China's economic intrusion, or not intrusion, presence in countries that the Russians may not like Georgia? Chinese simply go to anywhere, whenever there's an opportunity. Chinese investment in Ukraine, for example, even more than investment in Russia. In the aftermath of the 2008 war, the Georgia war, Chinese continue to invest in Georgia. How do you perceive this kind of thing that regardless of relations with Russia, Chinese actually get into the backyard of Russia? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So let's have one more in this round, and then I'll come back to the people in this side of the room. Yes, so yes, kind of right. Yeah. Get a microphone. Thanks.
Thank you all. Very illuminating. My name is Mindy Reiser. I've lived and worked in Central Asia. I'm a sociologist and involved in a number of projects. First, I recognize that the media in Central Asia is not necessarily the most open, and there are constraints there, but that varies by country. And I'm wondering what kind of coverage there has been of the Chinese surveillance of its own population. That's in addition to what's been happening to the Uyghurs. And of course, in Kazakhstan, you have a Uyghur population, and there certainly are concerns there. I'm also intrigued with Eric's data, and as a social scientist, I'm interested in breaking it down in terms of the views of younger people toward China in Kazakhstan. How does that vary by education level, by media consumed, by use of internet, by occupation? Again, I go back to the indisputable fact that if you are a citizen of China, you are subject to a significant degree of surveillance. Now, people from the former Soviet Union are not ignorant of that way of being. And given that there have been changes in the relationship to the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore, and knowledge of opposition impacts on Russian life, I'm just wondering how this all plays out.
Okay, thank you. So let's turn back to the authors now, and maybe if you could take about no more than 3 or 4 minutes as best you can to respond, and that'll leave us time for, because there's several other questions waiting. So maybe we'll just go back in the order of the presentations and start with Eric.
Sure. Because the first thing is I want to both acknowledge, Marie, your comments about the limits of survey research, and also that the fact that there's much more to China than the leadership. So yes, but at the same time, I think as far as the things that many of us as political scientists are concerned about as intergovernmental relationships, I think it is substantially incredibly important how Central Asian governments perceive their populations viewing China, right? The leadership of China, more so than culture. Sebastian, you brought this up as well about the fact that Kazakh students in China aren't particularly attracted to Chinese culture. I think that's an interesting point, but at the daily level, and here I raise the case of Kyrgyzstan, where I think this is the country where you see this most operative, it makes a difference to an opposition candidate in Kyrgyzstan if she or he thinks that they can play the Chinese government card, this idea that there's corruption between the current government that they're opposing, that exists this corruption. If that card about the leadership can be played, I think that is substantively more immediate than whether or not Chinese culture resonates. Which is not to say that there aren't better ways to measure China than the way that the Gallup survey is doing. And Marlene and I were working on this together. In our own surveys, we're going to try to get much more fine-grained analysis. But that said, I think at the end of the day, it is this question about the leadership that ultimately will shape Chinese, Central Asian policy towards China, particularly in a place like Kyrgyzstan where there is room for political competition, where these kinds of issues can come up. And I actually think we're seeing this in Kazakhstan as well. I think Tokayev is responding in ways to this pressure. He feels the pressure, and it's not the pressure that is coming from cultural affinity, it's the pressure that people are exerting because they dislike what the Chinese government is doing. And in that sense, I think this question is critically important. Not to say that we don't want to look at the other ones, but I think this one is one we really do need to focus on.
Okay, Sebastian?
Well, thank you, Maria. Yes, I mean, well, I agree, of course. I mean, we can see on public diplomacy, we can see half bottle, I mean, empty or full. And for sure, I mean, as I said, actually, and as Eric explained very well, I mean, xenophobia and the development of xenophilia is a kind of very complicated phenomenon with plenty of intermixed feeling. And the second point is that it's also a long phenomenon. I mean, on a historical scale, if we look at China's soft power policy, I mean, it started only 10 years ago, whereas if you compare with, for example, what the European Union or what other countries like the United States have been working on that for so many years. So in a way, and I said that in my presentation, that I don't say that it's going to fail, but what I feel, and this is a feeling I have when I'm going to China and when I'm talking to, I wouldn't say to official people, but when I talk to people experts working in think tanks, there is a growing concern about what they view growing xenophobia, what they perceive as a growing xenophobia, wherever it's true or not, and whatever the extent of xenophobia or not. And on civil society, yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, civil society is not the only thing. Absolutely, I agree on that. There would be plenty of other avenues, but I think that in China, in Central Asia, it's important when they see the Chinese presence. For many people, it's important to feel that there's not just behind it the Chinese authorities. You know, for example, India is very popular in Central Asia because they are being really able to bring the civil society, for example, by education, by bringing a lot of assistance in healthcare, or even with cinema. You know, cinema is very popular, and China has not been able to do that so far because, again, they see, I mean, many people see this soft power as a way to hide the Chinese political authorities' hard power. But again, I agree with you, of course. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, for your comments. I will just shortly answer them. Perception, I mean, you just brought a very nice example, for example, Africa. So what Africa is also far distant from China, the same like Azerbaijan or Georgia or Armenia. And whether this perception would change, yes, it may change. It may change with a certain period of time when the Chinese interests are growing and the more and more Chinese may come to the countries and investment will continue. And we will see the presence of China in the countries much more than before. So far, we can say we don't have a Chinese anti-sentiments because maybe we haven't seen Chinese at all in our countries. That's maybe the reason versus Central Asia. So it can change. Yes, you're right on this issue. On a second question, on your comments or kind of disagreement with me that Chinese initiatives or platform is complementing EU. And you brought a right argument that what about human rights or protection of human rights or issues with that concern European Union more than China. I would say from this perspective, we have a little bit dualistic understanding of EU and China. We're always thinking that, okay, EU is for protection of human rights and China is against protection of human rights. So it cannot be like in the dualistic approach. China in a both way also interested in comparatively that the rules of the game in the country should be applicable to everyone. So, for example, if China for certain will demand certain type of democratization of the country, especially for the case of protection of investments, whether it's economic arbitrage or whether it's a courts or certain type of thing. So to say that China is not interested in democratization or certain type of institution in the country, it would be too over exaggeration. I would say China is also interested in the equal rights or equal, I would say, rules of the game for all competitors of all the companies in the country. Coming to the issues of the Chinese investment in the region and how it will be perceived by Russia and whether the Russia would be kind of against these kind of investments, I would say that it depends on the country. For example, if you look at the country of, for example, Armenia, that where the debt trap diplomacy was used actually not by Chinese but the Russians first, starting from 2000s when they took over from Armenians most of the enterprises for the debts. This policy didn't work from Russian side in Georgia and Azerbaijan because of Azerbaijan's economic resources and Georgia because of the political reasons. And when Chinese investments comes and start investing into this region, I don't think it will go against, or Russians will be kind of speaking against this investment because of the two things. Local elites in Georgia and Armenia are strong enough to oppose Russians' interventions in not allowing Chinese to come. And the second most important, what we see in many other places, Russians are very careful in criticizing Chinese. They usually do not criticize or do not go against or opposing Chinese certain type of initiatives, whether it's in a certain type of the country or whether it's in a region or something like that. Russians are very cautious to go against Chinese. They can criticize the United States, they can easily criticize European Union, they go against the European Union or United States knowing the fact that they will not answer proportionally. But the same rules of the game they don't do with Chinese. In this case, what we see in our region, Russians are not going Chinese because of them. Maybe it's a fear or maybe it's a understanding that Chinese would answer proportional or disproportionately to this kind of the Russian démarche on certain type of the issues. Thanks.
So let's see. So we have, I think, two questions over here, then one here, and then one there. Sorry. Well, we'll ask the panelists to get back to that afterwards. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Kate Waters. I'm with Crude Accountability. I had a question specifically about Kazakhstan and about investments in the oil and gas sector and perceptions around that. I wanted to sort of ask you to address the issues of concerns around and from the public about potentially strengthening corrupt relationships between elites in both countries. So you have oil and gas investments between the government of Kazakhstan and the Kazakhstani National Oil Company, the same on the Chinese side. A lot of times I think that looks like, and some of the speakers mentioned this, worker dissatisfaction, concern about wages or concern about employment opportunities. And that's part of it, but part of it is also environmental concerns, part of it is also social concerns in communities where oil and gas is being developed and in which there's very, very little information about what's actually happening. So I wondered if you could address that. And then I had a second, just brief question about Turkmenistan and Chinese investment in natural gas there, which seems to have had a devastating impact on the economy there, and if you could address that and public perception around that. Thank you.
Kathy Cosman, my questions also do have to do with public reaction in two cases, very specific government, making nice to China, shall we say. I believe it's correct that Nazarbayev sold 51%, in other words, controlling interest to China for the Kazakh National Oil Company, which I understand was the fact that led then to, maybe I'm wrong, but certainly the Chinese have a major share in the Kazakh National Oil Company, and as a result, Chinese managers were on the ground in Zhanaozen, and I was told, maybe I'm wrong on this, that the Chinese managers on site were even more corrupt than the Kazakh managers, and this was a major reason for the labor unrest there in 2011. Also, China has bought and or rented thousands of acres of land in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Obviously, the local population are not thrilled by that. And finally, I also wanted to follow up on the, to me, shocking treatment, persecution of not just the Uyghurs in China, but all Muslims in China, including several Han groups, which are traditionally Muslim. And this, I guess, got off the ground just as the Belt and Road Initiative was gaining strength, which to me, that just boggles the mind how the Chinese were so arrogant or blind as to think that this would not cause popular unrest, dissatisfaction in Central Asia.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. A good follow-on. If we look at the textbooks that are being used in those camps, we see that they're anti-Islamic. This is not anti-Uyghur or anti-Kyrgyz or anti-Kazakh. This is anti-Muslim. And about 12% of those prisoners are Kazakhs, in many cases actual cousins of the Kazakhs in Kazakhstan. And so there's some confusion in my mind. Kazakhstan holds all the cards here. They can stand up and say, your Belt and Road is frozen until such time as our people are out of those camps. Or better yet, let them emigrate to Kazakhstan. Why doesn't Kazakhstan play that card and make their religious conservatives very happy and free a lot of people?
Thanks. And in the front row here, please.
Hi there. Thanks. Akab Malik again. So my question last session wasn't answered, but this is not the same one. I'd like to talk about, because nobody mentioned this, the strategic alignment through organizations and security architecture that's been evolving over the last decade or so, such as the SEO, SICA, and how that actually may necessitate the formation or management of perceptions at a higher level and filter down, such as what China is doing in its own country. The control of information, for example, and how would that affect perceptions? Because perception formation and culture, etc., always comes from the top and dictated from the bottom to the bottom in that respect, through the media or the absence of it.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think each speaker would have about 3-4 minutes, and maybe if you can come back to the questions that might not have gotten addressed in the last round to that. So let's just start again with Erica.
Sure. Again, my apologies for not addressing some of the questions that came up before. I'll just briefly touch on them. I mean, the point about media surveillance is a fascinating one. Central Asians, like I think just about everyone, have misgivings about this. Actually, there's just a recent piece in Eurasia on this morning about Central Asian governments adopting Chinese technology to increase the surveillance state. And my sense is that Central Asians are certainly aware of this. They're certainly aware of this as a tool that China has used in northwest China. So I think there's knowledge about this. I also think that there's a degree of resignation about it, just as there's a degree of resignation about it here in the United States. That this is the way the world is, and it's very difficult to fight. Not that they're not fighting it, but I think this is something that is pretty well understood. As far your point about Kazakhstan and holding all the cards, I would actually respectfully disagree with your portrayal of Kazakhstan holding all the cards in this case, for a number of reasons. One, as I mentioned in my presentation, the largest single consumer of Kazakh exports is China. The other thing that I didn't mention in the presentation, and Sebastian can speak to this as well, is over the past, I think, 15 years, we've seen a change in the composition of who's investing in the oil industry in Kazakhstan. And we see a movement of Western companies out of the industry and a movement of China into the industry. And I think there is some concern, and rightfully so, that Kazakhstan really needs this investment in order to continue developing its primary export. So I would disagree in that sense that that Kazakhstan can just say, until you release everyone, we're not going to do business with you. And then the last thing on this point is what China is doing in northwest China, frankly, is not all that different than some of the things that Kazakhstan does in its own prisons. So it would be somewhat duplicitous, I think, of Kazakhstan to call China out on this score.
Okay, Sebastian.
Yeah, maybe sorry, indeed, we also skipped the question on culture and soft power. I mean, culture, Chinese culture in Central Asia, but also Central Asian culture in China. I mean, I can't say a lot, but reading on China and traveling there, and even being in universities where Central Asian are present. I mean, I don't think that so far really there's a big presence of Central Asian culture in China, although there have been more and more initiatives, especially since the launch of the Belt Road Initiative. You know, the diplomatic circles have been trying to develop some exhibitions on Central Asia, publishing some books, so that, Chinese people, knew a little bit more. But I think that this cultural presence of Central Asian culture in China so far remains limited. But again, this takes time. On Kate questions, yes, Eric talked already about mentioned several points, but the Chinese presence in Kazakhstan, oil and gas, has been since the very beginning of the 1990s a big issue for plenty of reasons, due to corruption, as you were mentioning, due also now more and more to working conditions. Chinese, whether it's true or not, Chinese companies are very often accused of not respecting local laws, or even using Chinese laws when they make people work. This sector has also been a point of concern in terms of corruption, because a lot of people consider that the Kazakhstan elite are signing contracts because they will make a lot of money on that. And we know how, sorry, no offense, but we know how Kazakhstani elites are corrupted. And another point, which is, I think I might be wrong, another point which will be very interesting to follow, to study, and which has been understudied so far, is, as you were mentioning, the environment impact. And on that, we don't know so much. By the way, if I may mention, to the next CSS, Central Eurasian Studies Society conference, Kate will be organizing a wonderful panel on this topic. So I strongly advise you to come and attend this event. On Turkmenistan, on China's presence in Turkmen gas, yes, this is definitely a huge issue, because, as you know, the Turkmen government never diversified the economy. China is controlling most of the gas, and not only it's controlling most of the gas, but actually Turkmenistan makes a really low amount of money, because Turkmenistan has to refund actually all the investments of China to exploit the gas sites in Turkmenistan. And another question. Again, as the economy is not diversified, and as China is controlling most of Turkmen gas, what happens, for example, if China's demand decreases? We have no idea about that, but I read several articles mentioning this issue. And here, just something which comes to my mind, which is just a supposition. But we know, for example, that China has the biggest reserves of shale gas in the world. So, for example, what happens if one day China really decides to exploit all its shale gas, or most of it? In that case, it will significantly decrease China's demand for Turkmen gas. I'm not saying that is going to happen, but there are obviously a lot of risks, considering the non-diversification of Turkmenistan economy.
Anar?
I don't have any comments.
Okay. Maria, was there anything you'd like to add in conclusion? All right. Well, in that case, let me first of all thank Jeff and CSIS for making this all possible by bringing us all together. I'd also like to thank Carnegie Corporation of New York, GW's Elliott School, and the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies that provided kind of core funding to bringing a lot of the people here. I will say that the presentations are based on draft memos that the authors have written. Some actually are already published. I think Hillary's, for example, is already out. The others will be kind of rolling out, over time. And then we also invite you to join us tomorrow over at the Elliott School's building on E Street, between 19th and 20th for a full day of conferencing on other topics related to the post-Soviet region. Yes, so I think with that, please join me in thanking our panelists and thanking our hosts.